It is a cold, biting January 26th, the kind of day where the frost seems to seep into your very marrow, and as I, Davis Black, sit here under the dim hum of a single flickering bulb, I realize that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding under the bed, but the ones who tucked you into it. You see, people in the West love the image of the white picket fence family, the curated Instagram perfection of Sunday roasts and holiday sweaters, but they rarely talk about the architecture of a breakdown. How some families don't just raise children, they dismantle them, piece by agonizing piece, until there is nothing left but a hollow shell wearing a familiar name. I remember the winter of my 16th year, right around this same date, when I realized that my home was not a sanctuary but a laboratory of psychological warfare where my parents, the esteemed Dr. and Mrs. Black, practiced the art of emotional erasure. It started with the quieting. The way my father would look through me as if I were made of glass whenever I expressed a dream that didn't fit his blueprint for a legacy, and how my mother would weaponize her disappointment like a slow-acting poison, making sure I knew that every breath I took was a debt I could never repay. They didn't hit me. No, bruises would have been too easy to explain to a school counselor, but instead, they used gaslighting like a surgeon uses a scalpel, cutting away my sense of reality until I was apologizing for things I hadn't done and feeling guilty for the mere crime of existing. The suspense of living in that house was like walking through a minefield where the triggers changed every day. One moment I was the golden boy they bragged about at the country club, and the next, I was a burden and a failure because I dared to have a heartbeat they couldn't synchronize. On this particular January 26th, years ago, the facade finally shattered during a silent dinner that felt more like a wake, when I realized that their love wasn't a gift, it was a leash, and the reason some families destroy their own is that they cannot stand to see a version of you that they cannot control, or worse, a version that reflects the failures they refuse to face in themselves. They see your potential not as something to nurture, but as a threat to their own fragile egos, and so they prune your spirit back until you are as twisted and stunted as a bonsai tree, beautiful to look at but dying on the inside. I watched my sister wither under that same sun, becoming a ghost in her own room because she couldn't play the game as well as I could, and the moral of this tragedy, if you can even call it that, is that blood isn't thicker than water when the blood is toxic. It's just a more efficient way to spread the infection. I escaped that night, leaving behind the Davis Black they had carefully constructed and stepping out into the freezing January air with nothing but the clothes on my back and a soul that felt like a shattered mirror. And even now, a decade later, I still check the shadows, wondering if I ever truly got away or if I'm just a character in a story they're still writing. We celebrate this day as a marker of time, but for me it's a memorial to the boy who had to die so the man could survive. A reminder that the ultimate betrayal isn't from an enemy you see coming, but from the hands that were supposed to hold you steady while you learn to walk. Some families destroy their children because they would rather own a broken thing than lose a whole one, and as I sit here in the silence of 2026, I tell you this not for pity, but as a warning. Look closely at the perfect families you know, because under the surface, there is often a quiet, desperate war being fought, and sometimes, the only way to win is to burn the bridge while you're still standing on it. The silence that follows the shattering of a family isn't peaceful. It's a ringing, high-pitched frequency that stays in your ears for years, and as I sit here now, staring at a digital invitation to my father's legacy gala, arriving on this freezing January 26, 2026, I realize the destruction didn't end the night I walked out. It just changed form. You see, when a family decides to emotionally dismantle a child, they don't just stop because the child is gone. They keep a version of you alive in their own narrative, a sacrificial lamb they blame for every shadow in their own hearts. And as Davis Black, I've spent the last decade trying to outrun a ghost that carries my own face. This special episode of my life isn't about the escape, but about the horrifying realization of why they did it. They didn't hate me. They were terrified of me because I was the only mirror in that house that didn't have a filter, reflecting back their insecurities, their failed ambitions, and the hollow artifice of their perfect, Western aristocratic life. I remember finding a journal my mother kept, hidden behind the mahogany panels of the library, where she hadn't written about her love for her children, but had meticulously logged my deviations from her expected norm, treating my personality like a series of glitches in a software program that needed to be patched out through isolation and calculated coldness. It's a suspenseful game of chess where you don't know you're a pawn until you're already off the board, and tonight, As the snow piles up against my window in this city that doesn't know my real name, I understand that some parents destroy their children because they are addicted to the power of fixing something they intentionally broke. They create the wound so they can be the only ones allowed to provide the bandage. A sick cycle of manufactured codependency that looks like tough love to the neighbors but feels like a slow drowning to the one inside. I heard through the grapevine that my sister, the one who stayed, has finally stopped speaking entirely. A living statue in that mausoleum of a house, and the guilt of leaving her behind is a weight that January 26th always makes heavier. A reminder that, in the war of family dynamics, the one who escapes is often haunted by the ones who couldn't find the door. The moral of this unfolding nightmare is that the ultimate act of rebellion isn't anger. It's indifference. It's looking at the people who gave you life and realizing they are just strangers with a shared blood type who never bothered to learn the language of your soul. They wanted a trophy to polish, a legacy to secure, a second chance at their own wasted youth. And when I refused to be their canvas, they tried to burn the brushes and the artist too. But here is the suspenseful truth they never expected. A child who has been emotionally destroyed doesn't always stay broken. Sometimes we rebuild ourselves out of the debris with edges sharper than the knives they used on us, and as I delete that invitation and watch the cursor blink in the dark, I realize that the Davis Black they think they know died a long time ago, and the man sitting here today is someone they should be very, very afraid of because I am finally the author of my own story, and I've decided that the final chapter won't be a tragedy. It will be a reckoning. Some families destroy their children because they fear the light those children carry, but they forget that even in the deepest dark of a January night, a single spark can burn the whole lie down, and I am finally ready to strike the match and walk away from the ashes once and for all. The engine of my car ticked in the freezing silence of the driveway, a stark contrast to the thumping bass and the golden glow spilling from the windows of my childhood home. A sprawling, ivy-covered estate in the English countryside that looked more like a fortress than a residence on this bitter January 26th evening. As I, Davis Black, straightened my tie in the rearview mirror, I saw a man who had spent 10 years trying to scrub the broken out of his bones, only to realize that the cracks are where the strength is forged. Stepping out into the biting wind, I walked toward that gala not as a guest, but as a witness to a crime that has no statute of limitations: the theft of a child's identity. The air inside the mansion was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the even more expensive lies of high society families who trade their children's mental health for the sake of a polished reputation. I saw my father first, standing at the center of a circle of admirers, his laughter sounding like the rattling of dry leaves. A man who had spent my youth convincing me that I was a deficit he had to manage, a mistake he had to edit until I was unrecognizable. When our eyes met, for a split second, the mask slipped, and I saw the sheer terror of a man who realized his project had returned with a mind of its own. My mother approached, her smile as sharp and fragile as a glass shard, whispering about forgiveness and family loyalty, as if those words could bridge the abyss of the nights I spent wondering why I wasn't enough to be loved without conditions. I realized then, with a chilling clarity that only the dead of winter can bring, that some families destroy their own children because they view them as extensions of their own ego rather than independent souls. They don't want a son, they want a monument to their own success, and when that monument shows a single flaw, they would rather demolish it than admit they aren't perfect architects. I stood in the middle of that opulent room and didn't scream, didn't create a scene, but instead, I began to speak, quietly, firmly, to anyone who would listen, telling the true story of the legacy being celebrated tonight, pulling back the velvet curtains on the psychological cruelty that had been polished to a shine. The suspense in the room became a physical weight as the guests realized the prodigal son wasn't here to repent, but to testify. I looked at my sister, still huddled in the corner like a wounded bird, and in that moment, I knew my mission wasn't just my own survival, but to show her that the walls of this prison are made of paper, held up only by the fear we've been conditioned to feel. The moral of this final stand is that the most powerful thing you can do to a family that tried to destroy you is to exist loudly and unapologetically, as the person they tried to kill off. By the time I walked back out into the snow, the Legacy Gala was in ruins, not because of fire or violence, but because the truth is a corrosive element to a house built on deception. As I drove away from the lights of the estate, leaving the name Davis Black behind in the slush of the driveway, I felt the first real warmth I've known in 26 years, realizing that while they might have broken my spirit once, they gave me the tools to build a soul that no one can ever touch again. The destruction was their choice, but the resurrection is mine, and on this January 26th, the only thing being celebrated is the end of their reign and the beginning of my breath. The headlights of my car cut through the thick, suffocating mist of the countryside as I drove further away from that mausoleum of a home. Yet the psychological chains felt heavier than ever, because I realized that the true reason families like mine destroy their own isn't out of a lack of love, but out of a perverse, parasitic need to consume the very life force they created. As Davis Black, I spent years wondering if there was a secret defect in my DNA, some invisible rot that made me deserving of their coldness. But as the miles stretched between us, the truth became a cold, hard stone in my gut. They destroyed me because I was the only thing in their world they couldn't fully automate. My parents didn't want a son. They wanted a mirror that only reflected their imagined virtues, and when I started showing the imperfections of a human soul, the doubts, the raw emotions, the refusal to be a silent cog in their social machine, they saw it as a malfunction that had to be punished. This is the suspenseful horror of the domestic sphere. The people who should be your strongest advocates become your most meticulous saboteurs, watching your every move not with pride, but with the predatory gaze of a jailer looking for a reason to tighten the cuffs. I began to understand that my father's perfectionism was actually a deep-seated cowardice. He had been crushed by his own father, and instead of breaking the cycle, he chose to become the hammer, finding a sick kind of relief in breaking me before the world could break him again. They don't destroy you because you are weak. They destroy you because your strength reminds them of the courage they threw away decades ago. I remember sitting in a roadside diner, the neon light flickering against the rain-slicked window, realizing that for families like the Blacks, a child's independence is seen as a declaration of war, an unforgivable act of treason against the family brand. They weaponize your memories, turning your childhood milestones into leverage, making you feel that every sacrifice they ever made was a deposit in a bank account you can never balance, ensuring you remain emotionally bankrupt and perpetually under their thumb. The suspense of this life is never knowing when the next test is coming, or realizing that the very person holding your hand is the one guiding you toward the edge of the cliff. The moral of this wreckage is that some parents would rather have a dead legacy than a living, breathing stranger for a son, because a dead legacy is something they can still control, still narrate, and still use to garner sympathy from a world that only sees the polished surface. I thought about my sister, trapped in that gilded cage, her silence a screaming indictment of a system that prizes obedience over life, and I knew that the only way to truly survive was to stop looking for their approval as if it were oxygen. You have to realize that you are not a project to be finished or a disappointment to be managed. You are a sovereign being, and their failure to see that isn't your burden to carry. The destruction they visit upon you is a confession of their own emptiness, a desperate attempt to fill the void in their hearts with the shards of yours. As I merged onto the highway, the dark silhouette of the hills behind me looked like sleeping giants, and I understood that I wasn't just escaping a house. I was escaping an ideology that treats children like property. I am the survivor of an invisible war, a man stitched together from the remnants of a boy they tried to erase, and the suspense now lies not in what they will do next, but in what I will do with this terrifying, beautiful freedom. Some families destroy their own because they are terrified of the light you carry, but they forget that a fire they tried to put out can easily become the blaze that lights your way out of the dark. And for the first time in my life, I am not looking back at the shadows they cast, but forward into the blinding, uncertain dawn of a life that finally, hauntingly, belongs entirely to me. The highway stretched out before me like a long, black scar across the earth, and as I, Davis Black, pressed my foot harder against the accelerator, I felt the phantom weight of my father's hand on my shoulder. Not a hand of guidance, but the heavy, crushing grip of a man who viewed his son as a failing investment. To understand why families like mine destroy their own, you have to understand the terrifying silence of a dinner table where every clink of a fork is a judgment and every breath is a performance. They don't come at you with knives. They come at you with expectations and disappointments, slowly eroding your self-worth until you're convinced that your very existence is a debt you can never fully repay. I watched the city lights flicker in the distance and realized that my parents' love was a conditional currency. It was only handed out when I acted as the perfect extension of their own shattered egos, a biological prosthetic designed to walk the path they were too afraid to take. The suspense of being raised by emotional vampires is the constant, low-grade fever of anxiety. The feeling that you are a character in a play where you haven't been given the script, yet you are punished for every missed cue. They destroy you because they are terrified of the person you might become without them, a person who doesn't need their validation, a person who might look back and see their traditions for the psychological prison they truly are. I remembered my mother's voice, always soft and melodic, yet laced with a poison that made me doubt my own eyes. She would tell me I was sensitive or unstable every time I called out the cruelty I saw, a classic gaslighting maneuver designed to make me the architect of my own mental collapse. They isolate you, making you feel that the world outside is a dangerous, unforgiving place and that only they can truly protect you, while they are the ones quietly draining the blood from your heart. This is the dark moral of the story. Some families don't want you to grow, they want you to stay small enough to fit inside their pockets, and when you start to outgrow the space they've allocated for you, they start cutting away at your limbs to make you fit again. I thought about the years I spent apologizing for things I never did, the years I spent trying to fix a relationship that was intentionally rigged to fail, realizing that you can't heal in the same environment that made you sick. The suspense now shifted from surviving them to surviving the memory of them. The way their voices still echo in my head telling me I'm not enough, that I'm a failure, that I'll never make it on my own. But as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the road, I realized that my survival was their greatest fear. A destroyed child who refuses to stay broken is a living testament to their failure as gods. They wanted a tragedy, a story of a son who couldn't handle the world and had to crawl back to the safety of their control. But instead, they got a man who took the very bricks they threw at him and used them to build a wall they can never climb over. My sister's face flashed in my mind, her eyes hollowed out by years of polite abuse. And I knew that my journey wasn't over until I showed her that the darkness they surround us with isn't a wall, but a curtain that can be pulled back. Some families destroy their children because they are too cowardly to face their own shadows, so they project that darkness onto the next generation, hoping to bury it forever. But they forget that children are seeds, and even when you try to bury them under a mountain of emotional wreckage, they will eventually find a way to break through the dirt and reach for the light. I am no longer Davis Black, the project. I am Davis Black, the person, and as the engine hums a song of liberation, I realize that the most suspenseful part of my life isn't the trauma they gave me, but the limitless, terrifyingly beautiful potential of who I am about to become without them. I am driving into a future they can't see, a life they can't touch, and for the first time, the silence isn't a threat. It's a blank page, and I finally have my own pen.